The newly elected president of the United States has been rocking the world with his decisions since his inauguration. On the very first day as president of the U.S., Trump signed over 200 executive orders on several issues ranging from trade to energy and climate to immigration. And all of these are central to his Make America Great Again agenda. However, some of the executive orders have sent shockwaves across the world and have even garnered criticism. Now, some analysts have said that some of Trump's orders can potentially impact Africa negatively. But is this really true? Let's find out. Trump has long criticized international agreements that, in his view, disadvantage American taxpayers and values. This is why he signed these executive orders, which analysts have said might affect Africa. Let's take a look at each of them. Suspension of foreign aid program. Trump's executive order freezes disbursement of all U.S. foreign development assistance for 90 days pending a review of programmatic efficiencies and ensuring that disbursements are aligned with the foreign policy of the President of the United States. According to Trump, the foreign aid industry and bureaucracy are not aligned with American interests and in many cases antithetical to American values. Under the executive order, all department and agency heads with responsibility for the U.S. foreign development assistance programs shall immediately pause new obligations and disbursement of development assistance funds to foreign countries, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and contractors. You see, the traditional thinking is that the African continent is so poor and cannot take care of itself, and so it's up to the good people of the West to help the continent. So they try to help by pouring billions of dollars into Africa through foreign aid and other private sector flows, and according to them, they do not receive anything in return from the continent. But that kind of thinking is false. It's actually the reverse. The African continent has been a net creditor to the rest of the world for decades while its people suffer under the so-called aid given by the Good West. It's reported that in 2014, Africa received a sum of $133.7 billion in aid. But do you know how much left the continent that same year? A whopping $191.9 billion in the form of debt repayments, multinational company profits, and illicit financial flows. The worst part is that the majority of the funds flowing out of the continent are due to conditions set up by Western institutions. These conditions require foreign multinational companies to set up their companies in Africa, giving them access to exploit our resources. It's these companies that are involved in the financial drain of the African continent. This is why we say that foreign aid is a tool of Western exploitation. If Trump wants to stop it, he has the full consent of the African people. You see, the truth is that if the West stops giving aid to African countries, the African people will not notice. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are good examples of this. When the West suspended financial support to these countries, it did not make any difference to the Burkinabe or Malian citizens. And neither did it make any difference to the citizens in Niger. Do you know why? It's because the money doesn't get to them in the first place. Instead, all those $1 billion worth of aid disappear into the pockets of greedy African politicians. In Senegal, for instance, $4 million was budgeted to increase cattle production in the Bakel region. But at the end of the day, only 882 additional cattle ended up being reared. The big question is, where did the money go? Obviously into the pockets of Senegal's politicians. But guess what? The military leaders of the Sahel country have been surviving without Western aid. Mali, for instance, recently began to pay $332 million of its internal debt. Burkina Faso has engaged in several development projects without Western aid. Doesn't this tell you that African countries can survive without Western help? The truth is, Africa doesn't need the West, but the West needs Africa. External Revenue Service. We all know how Trump loves his tariffs. So, it's not really a surprise that he announced plans to establish an External Revenue Service with a broader plan of using it to collect tariffs, duties, and other foreign trade-related revenue. According to analysts, this move can potentially disrupt international trade and further complicate the already complex global tax system. However, a major impact of this move could be the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which grants African countries duty-free access to the American market. Interestingly, the African Growth and Opportunity Act is expiring this year, and there are already doubts on whether Trump would renew it. But even if Trump renews it and imposes tariffs, It is only African countries like South Africa that might be affected. You see, most African countries under the African Growth and Opportunity Act export primary goods which Trump doesn't really care about. South Africa, on the other hand, exports key products like cars, wines, and grapes. Besides this, South Africa is currently the biggest beneficiary of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So, South Africa might be affected. However, even if South Africa is affected, the country can simply look for another market. The US has a large market, but South Africa is a founding member of BRICS, which currently controls more than half of the world's population. So, BRICS can provide another alternative for South African products. Withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. For years, Trump has been a fierce critic of climate change. In the past, Trump made a series of unfounded statements about climate change, including his 2012 post on Twitter that the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. During the run-up to the November 2024 election, as well as his inauguration, climate activists were concerned he would reverse the global gains made in the fight against climate change. And that is exactly what he did by issuing an executive order stating that the US is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Meanwhile, even though Africa is the least contributor to the world's carbon emissions, the continent has been experiencing the worst effects of climate change. Under the Paris Agreement, the West has been pushing African countries to ditch their fossil fuel resources and embrace green energy. However, African countries have pushed back, demanding that the West finance the green energy projects. This is because, for decades, the West has used fossil fuels to develop their countries. Meanwhile, Africa was still dealing with colonization and the aftermath. And now that Africans are ready to use fossil fuels to industrialize, the world is beginning to suffer from the effects of the carbon emissions produced by the West. It's not a fair situation, as it's always the case between Africa and the West. However, for the sake of the effects of climate change, African countries will have to seek partners like China and Russia to help with the development of green energy. Withdrawal from World Health Organization. Just like climate change, Trump has been quite vocal about the World Health Organization. During Trump's first term in 2020, he attempted to get the US to part ways with the Global Health Organization, citing its alleged mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic and other global health crises. However, President Biden reversed the decision. But right now, the US is no longer a part of World Health Organization as a result of the executive order issued by Trump. Trump condemned the organization's funding structure, claiming the US bears an unfair financial burden compared to China, which he said contributes nearly 90% less. The US is the World Health Organization's top donor and partner, contributing $1.284 billion during the 2022 to 2023 biennium. The withdrawal of US funding will negatively impact the World Health Organization and its partners to identify and respond to emergencies across the world and advance other key global health priorities. Analysts have said that the withdrawal of the US from WHO will make Africa face heightened health risks. The World Health Organization has helped fight against certain diseases such as malaria and HIV. Well, while the WHO is a major financial donor for Africa's health, it's not the only one. The African continent may not be as developed as the West, but it has come a long way. Africa will survive health-wise with or without the help of WHO. National Energy Emergency. Trump's declaration of a national energy emergency marks a dramatic shift in US energy policy with far-reaching global implications. As we said earlier, Trump intends to boost domestic fossil fuel exploration and production. But doing this could intensify competition in global energy markets, potentially lowering oil and gas prices. For African countries dependent on oil like Nigeria and Angola, this poses a threat as they will have to compete with the US for market share. During Trump's first term, he pushed for a similar initiative which led to an oil glut that slashed prices, cutting into Nigeria's oil revenue and amplifying economic vulnerabilities. This executive order can definitely affect African countries dependent on fuel negatively. However, perhaps it might be the boost they need to diversify their economy and reduce their reliance on oil. So in our opinion, it's a very good one. immigrations, and deportations. The U.S. President's executive order declaring illegal immigration a national emergency and ordering deportations, though primarily aimed at South American migrants, may affect undocumented African immigrants. The order can also reduce opportunities for Africans seeking to migrate to the U.S. This could limit access to education and employment for talented individuals from the continent, exacerbating brain drain challenges. African families in the U.S. might also face heightened legal and financial challenges, as changes to citizenship policies and deportation programs create uncertainty. Moreover, the reduction in immigrant remittances, a vital source of income of some African households, could have a detrimental economic impact across the continent. Well, many people can view this as a negative impact, but in our opinion, it's also a good one. Africans should come back to their countries and fix it. Running away to the West only enforces the narrative that there is nothing good about the continent. If every African consciously works together, things will definitely improve. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.